Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Alright, welcome to part 11 of the Mana Ramp series. This one will be a summation of everything up until this point. It's just about the best Mana Ramp. So I do want to summarize each of the 10 categories pretty quick before getting into the part where I will just describe what I think are some good actual strategies and ways to implement your ramp. So we'll go in order, starting with land ramp. This will be the things that will get lands out of your library and put them onto the battlefield. So real quick, cultivate, Kadama's Reach, Nissa's Pilgrimage, Sky Shroud, Claim, Peregrination, Migration Path, Ranger's Path, Circuitous Route, Explosive Vegetation, Hunting Wilds. If you're going to try to ramp in this way, I generally suggest using 10 cards, and here's 10 right here. Now, there are 6 more that I would recommend within this category. So of the 16, pick 10 that make the most sense, or pick the 10 cheapest, or pick the 10 that you just happen to already own. So generally speaking, I would say Kadama's Reach, Cultivate, and Nissa's Pilgrimage are the best ones that should almost always be included. And then the other 7 you choose from whatever else remains. The reason why those ones are the best and the most important is because they cost 3 mana. You get them out on turn 3. And while it's not the end of the world if you just play a land for your first 3 turns and then on turn 4 you cast one of the other things, at least being able to cast, Kadama's Reach, Cultivate, or Nissa's Pilgrimage on turn 3 a good chunk of the time. In most games you'll have one of those in your hand or have drawn it by turn 3. It's a pretty big step forward, and they're kind of the foundation for this. And then the other 6 cards would be Boundless Realms, Traverse the Outlands, Colony Heart Expedition, Harvest Season, Journey of Discovery, and Grow from the Ashes. Colony Heart Expedition I think is probably the best, just because possibly out of all of these, because it only costs 2 mana, meaning that you can get it out on turn 2. Then on turn 3 you play your land drop, you play your cultivate. You're already 2/3 the way towards actually being able to get the land off of Colony Heart Expedition. So the fact that it just gives you a 2-drop is really valuable, unless you have a bunch of other things within your deck that aren't ramp that will come down on turn 2. Boundless Realms is highly valuable in any deck already running a bunch of these ramp spells, because you're probably going to have 8, 9, 10 lands on board or more just from using the other ramp spell. So this one will instantly double what is already a good amount. So you cast this on like turn 5 or 6 and you're off to the races. Traverse the Outland is obviously much better in big creature decks, whether it's just like one single big creature or your deck is full of like 20 big creatures and just one of them happens to be in the battlefield, then that's a great one to have. Harvest Season is more if you got a bunch of little creatures, tokens, things like that. But even if you just get 2 lands off of it, it's a 3 mana Explosive Vegetation. That's not a bad value. And then the other 2 have their own unique situations where you'd want to use them. Journey of Discovery could be used either if you are missing your land drop, just get 2 lands to your hand, play one of them this turn, and then save the other one for the following turn. Or if you've been drawing like crazy and your hand is full of lands, you can use the half where you just put 2 of them into play. Or you could, if you got mana to spare, entwine it and get 2 out of your library and then play 2. And notably, you don't have to play the same 2 that you grab. So you could grab 2 basics from your library, put them into your hand, and then play 2 better non-basic lands. Grow from the Ashes. One reason that I kind of stay away from this one is if you ever are on turn 3 and you're about, going into turn 4, turn 3, say you don't have any other ramp spell, you're going to be tempted to play this. Turn 4, if you miss your land drop, say you haven't already cast this on turn 3, you're saving it. On turn 4, if you don't hit your land drop, now you really have to. And this is just a card that to me feels bad to cast it without paying the kicker cost. So moving on, there are a handful that I don't think are very good in most circumstances. So if you're playing a normal game, a casual game, a non-CEDH game, I don't think that these cards, Rampant Growth, Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, Into the North, Farseek, Secure Tribe Elder, Harrow, Blighted Woodland, Myriad Landscape, and this is Renewal are generally going to be very good for you. The reason, with the first 6 of them anyway, is because even though you do get a turn 2 play and you do get to ramp earlier, the fact that you're only taking 1 land out of your library isn't going to do you very much good in the grand scheme of things. And if you happen to play one of these later in the game, like turn 5, 6, 7, 8, then its impact is drastically lower. At least a Cultivate on turn 5 or 6, just the fact that it's getting 2 lands out of your library and it's getting you that much closer to a spell that you want, that has purpose and value. And it shouldn't be underestimated how much better that can make the rest of your game go compared to something that is only getting you 1 land out of your library. And realistically, if you're casting these on curve at turn 2, the extra ramp that they provide isn't usually, in a casual game, going to make a difference over the course of the game. Because you'll have access to 4 mana on turn 3, and you might still be a little bit ahead on turn 4. But once you get to turn 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that 1 extra land that you got with these aren't going to matter. So especially if you're casting 2 or 3 of these over the course of the game, it's just you're wasting card slots within your deck. Harrow is especially one that I think is bad because it gets you 2 out of your library, so it does have the deck thinning benefit, but the fact that you have to sacrifice 1 means that you're only coming ahead by 1 land, and it costs 3, so it's 3 mana for 1 land, and it's at instant speed, so you might do it like during the end step before your turn or something like that. But unless you end up using the 2 lands that you get into play like right then, right away, you're not like recouping the cost of it. If you do this at some point during your turn, like you tap, some lands for mana, you sacrifice 1 of those to cast this, you get 2. Effectively, this kind of costs 1 mana, but if you're doing it at instant speed, then you're not getting that benefit. And then Blighted Woodland, Myriad Landscape are terrible value. I go into a little bit more detail about that in the other video about this kind of ramp. This is Renewal. I actually like it overall, but the fact that it gets you 3 lands for 6 mana, it's a good rate. It's consistent with like a Explosive Vegetation type thing. The 7 life that you gain is just gravy, but the fact that it costs 6 mana does make it a little bit harder to justify within a deck. I'm okay with waiting till turn 3 for Cultivate, and then on turn 4 casting an Explosive Vegetation and nothing else, but I don't want to still be like necessarily waiting to ramp this late. Even if I've done the other ones first, because I've drawn those first and I'm able to do this, it's great. But if this ends up being like my only ramp spell, it's just coming way too late. And so I'd rather limit the number of those that I have, and Boundless Realms and Traverse the Outlands are going to be the 2 obvious choices that are higher up on the land ramp curve. So next let's talk about the ETB Lands Ramp. So this is one that obviously I think it goes, if you're playing a deck that cares about ETBs, if you're playing things like Panharmonicon and things that double ETBs, if you're playing things that bounce and flicker and get extra value, then you're going to want a lot of these within that deck. Or if you have, a lot of these happen to be tribal, elves especially. So if you happen to be playing one of those tribes, you're going to include those just as part of the tribal synergy, not so much as a key piece of ramp. But they do kind of belong sporadically. But things like Wood Elves, Farhaven Elf, Ulvenwold Hydra, Avatar of Growth, I wouldn't really justify putting those in a deck just by itself, just as where you are consciously thinking this is something that's important in my deck is ramp. Wood Elves is in a lot of decks, and it probably shouldn't be. I get that the land comes into play untapped, and that's satisfying, but it's just not something that, if your deck isn't built to make use out of it, it's not something that's going to really benefit you very much. And I would recommend playing these in either I'll get to recommendations later, but these are things that make the most sense in an ETB based deck. So next let's talk about Elves Mana-Dork Ramp. So obviously there are a lot of elves that tap for mana. I brought up Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, Fyndhorn Elves, and Boreal Druid because these ones are 1 mana and will tap for 1 mana. So these are ones that could go in just about any deck if you wanted to. The other ones that care about elves, like Priest of Titania, I did not include those because if you're playing those, then you're playing a designated elf deck. And if you're playing a designated elf deck, you're going to have a lot of elf Mana-Dorks. You're probably going to want to check out the video that's specifically about elf Mana-Dorks. But if you're just playing a normal deck that isn't elf tribal, that doesn't specifically care about elves, these are ones that make a lot of sense. The 2 mana ones, you're probably not going to want to get too invested in just because they cost twice as much to do the same effect. Although some of them do give you like mana of any color, but that's the main benefit to these ones is that they're 1 mana, they'll ramp you right away on turn 1. Again, I don't really recommend making these a key part of your mana ramp package, or rather combining them with other things. I have kept all these categories separate, not only to classify them and describe them, but also because it doesn't make sense to have your deck include Cultivate Kadama's Reach and then Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic. Your deck is just doing different weird things and it's going to perform inconsistently. So next, let's talk about a few of the not Elves Mana-Dorks. So these are the ones that kind of stand out to me as the ones that I like for the most part. Leafkin Druid, Ilzian Caratolid, Circle of Elders, Whisperer of the Wilds, Karametra's Acolyte, Birds of Paradise, Nantuko Elder, and Somber Walled Sage. Now, a few of those will at least tap for 1, but will sometimes tap for 2. That would be the Leafkin Druid, the Ilzian Caratolid, and the Whisperer of Wilds. Circle of Elders will either not tap for mana, or it will tap for 3 colorless. Somber Walled Sage does have the restriction of only being allowed to use the mana on creatures. Nantuko Elder is just a 3 mana, taps for 2, and that one's a pretty good rate, I think, if you're looking for something that isn't just a 1 mana Mana-Dork. The main reason to play any of these is if you're just trying to go out of your way to avoid elves. If you just feel that elves are a little bit too cliche and you kind of want to get away from that, that's kind of the main reason that you would play a lot of these. But overall, if you are going to build your deck with 20, 30 Mana-Dorks, you're going to want the elves for the elf synergies. Karametra's Acolyte is a great one. Even if you're playing 2 or 3 colors, minimum, if she's the only green permanent on the board, she'll tap for 1 green. If your commander's out and he has 1 green pip, she'll tap for 2. Any green permanents beyond that, she can tap for 3, 4, 5, even in a 3-color deck. In a mono-green deck, she should tap for anywhere from like 3 to 20 without much of a problem. Birds of Paradise, I don't use it because I don't really care about the fact that it'll add mana of any color. Again, if I'm using Mana-Dorks, I'd prefer to just stick with elves. They make the most sense. But this one sees a ton of play in Commander because it taps for any color. And it is a 1 mana Mana-Dork. So for that reason, I do want to include it right here and recommend it as a good, viable choice. Next, we're going to talk about Doubler's Ramp. These are the things that will double your mana, or double the mana that things will produce. So, Vernal Bloom, Mana Reflection, Gauntlet of Power, Caged Sun, Zendikar Resurgent, Nyx Bloom Ancient, Nissa Who Shakes the World, Extraplanar Lens, Vorinclex, Voice of Hunger. Those are all land-based, except for Mana Reflection and Nyx Bloom, which will apply to any permanent. And then Leyline of Abundance specifically cares about creatures. So the last 2 categories of Mana-Dorks, they combo well with Leyline of Abundance. So these are some of the most powerful cards in green. And a few of them I know are artifacts, so they go in any color, but they are very, very, very powerful. And I would definitely say that Vernal Bloom, Mana Reflection, Zendikar Resurgent, those 3 in particular, probably in the top 5 best cards in green. At worst, top 10. So, yeah, they're pretty awesome, and I guarantee you that if you don't really use much of these effects, then throwing in like 5 in a deck, you'll see you're bound to draw at least one of them in a game, probably 2 or 3, and you're bound to see just how great it is at generating a ton of mana. Of course, if your goal is to do some sort of infinite combo, or it's just a 2-card thing and you need one card costs 3 mana, the other card costs 5 mana, you don't need a ton of mana. You need tutors in that combo. But for the most part, most decks, if you're just, casting a bunch of things and you want to cast your deck, if you want to be able to spend 30, 50, 80 mana in one turn, these are the things that'll get you there. And I know that when Nyx Bloom Ancient came out earlier this year, that's one that got a lot of people's attention and really got a lot of people interested in creating absurd amounts of mana. But there other similar effects, as you can see, have existed for quite a while, and frankly, I think that they do it better for the most part. I know that Nyx Bloom Ancient's the only one that will triple mana, and that is extremely valuable, extremely good. But there's a lot to be said about Vernal Bloom costing 4 mana and being able to come out that much earlier, and Mana Reflection being 6 mana and an enchantment. Same with Zendikar Resurgent. So they're less vulnerable. They're not going to die to a board wipe. Gauntlet of Power and Caged Sun, they're artifacts. So they're a little bit safer too. Nyx Bloom Ancient not only is a creature, but is an enchantment creature, so it's vulnerable to all kinds of effects that will get rid of it. And because of its popularity and notoriety recently, it's definitely got a bullseye on it. So next, the Auras ramp. So these ones are things that you would obviously be more inclined to include in a deck that cares about auras or enchantments altogether. And that would be where you'd most likely target it. There's some other really good places for them. We'll talk about Wild Growth, Utopia Sprawl, Overgrowth, Market Festival, and Dawn's Reflection as being some of the better ones. There are others. There's actually some that will not produce additional mana, but will at least make the land tap for any color of mana, so they're just color fixing. I couldn't really recommend those under really any circumstance. There's no point to it. But even some of the other ones that I don't include right here, they are maybe like 2 mana or 3 mana and produce 1 extra. So they're just worse than Wild Growth and Utopia Sprawl. So these are kind of the best 5, I think, for most decks. And the fact that 2 of them are only 1 mana means that you can get them out early. And they're good early, like right out of the gate type ramp. Elves Guidance is kind of the outlier of this group, because even though it's an aura that enchants a land, it specifically cares about elves. It's an elf tribal. It's for an elf deck. If you're playing an elf deck, you should 100% include this card. There's no reason not to include it in a designated elf deck. But in a deck that doesn't care about elves, then this card doesn't necessarily make any sense. So it is more conditional, but has a very high ceiling if, of course, you are playing an elf deck. So it's the best one of the group circumstantially. Next, we're going to talk about the Untap Lands Ramp. So these are things that will just, I think all of these happen to be creatures, but they're just things that will untap your lands, usually a single land, maybe 2. So Ley Druid, Ley Druid, Arbor Elf, Voyaging Satyr, Blossom Dryad, Elder Druid, Stone Cedar Hierophant, Juniper Order Druid, those will all untap a single land. Argothian Elder, Ley Weaver will untap 2. Crozan Restorer will untap 1, possibly 3 if you have Threshold. So these ones are the value varies. If you happen to be playing like all basics or otherwise lands that tap for 1 mana, then these are effectively like a Mana-Dork that costs 2, 3, 4 mana, which isn't a great rate. If you have lands that do a lot more than that, things like a Nykthos or anything that's just going to tap for 2 or 3 mana, like a bounce land or something, then these ones end up being extra good. They end up really pulling their weight in a better way. I personally would say that your most probable reason for wanting to include them in a deck is if you're playing something that cares about tapping and untapping things. If your deck wants you to tap, 15 times when you only have 8 permanents on play in a single turn, these are the kind of cards that are going to support what you're wanting to do, your play style, the goal of your deck, to just keep touching your cards over and over. And these cards all have varying degrees of effectiveness. Elder Druid is worth pointing out or separating from the pack because it will allow you to tap or untap an artifact, creature, or land. So if you're in a deck, and by the way, that's an Elf Druid. I don't believe it's still a Cleric, so it's just Elf Druid. That one is very good in an Elf Tribal deck, because if you happen to have that Priest of Titania out, or Marwyn, or whoever, an Elf that might tap for 20 mana, you can untap that. If you have an artifact that maybe it's just, what are they, Thran Dynamo, or Gilded Lotus? Taps for 3 of any color? Yeah, so, well, that one would not be super good with this because he costs 4 to activate. And that's the downside to him, is that he does cost a lot to activate, so you do need something that will tap for a bunch of mana to do that. Or, of course, you do have the option to tap down one of your opponent's things. Maybe you have an artifact or creature that does other purposes besides ramp, and you want to untap it to do its other whatever effect it is. Again, in like a tapper deck, maybe some of your creatures tap to deal damage or to draw you cards or whatever. He can help you with that. And then, yeah, there's one other card here that I'm going to talk about more later, because it's actually one of the best cards in green, possibly the best card in green. Is up there right now. Let's see if you figure it out. So next, let's talk about things that put into play as far as for your ramp. So, whereas the land ramp gets you lands from your library that you tutor out and then put directly into play, these are things that will allow you to put extra lands that are already in your hand into play. So they don't get you the card advantage, but if you're already drawing a bunch of cards and your hand is full of lands, this at least gives you a way to put them into play without eventually having to throw them away during your discard phase. So Exploration, Burgeoning, Azusa, Lost but Seeking, Dryad of the Illusion Grove, and Gaia's Touch, those are ones that you'll probably see fairly often. Not so much Gaia's Touch, but the other 4. They allow you just to play extra lands. And I think that more often than not, these ones are overrated, just because if you get it out on turn 1, like the Exploration or Burgeoning, then yeah, by turn 2, you can have quite a few lands in play. But then you have no cards in hand, and you're not really doing anything after that. Unless you have a way to completely refill your hand, you'll have gotten off to a very fast start, but by turn 4 or 5, you're just going to have the same 4 or 5 lands out, and you haven't actually ramped. I mean, you've gotten that temporary boost, but you're right back down to where everybody else is. And yeah, I'm not a huge fan of them, unless you're doing a landfall deck or something like that. The other ones I actually do like a lot more. That would be Llanowar Scout, Secure Tribe Scout, Skyshroud Ranger, Walking Atlas, and Budoka Gardener. Now, the reason why I like them is because, 1, they are creatures. So, if you're playing a creature deck where things will draw you cards for each creature you have, or whenever you cast a creature, these ones will trigger that. So would Azusa and Dryad of the Illusion Grove, but the other 3 won't. So that's a plus for them. Second of all, they are very cheap. 2 of them are 1 mana, 3 of them are 2 mana. So they do come out very early. Third is that they'll allow you to play, with the exception of Skyshroud Ranger, you can play the land or put the land into play at any time. So you could do it during your opponent's turns, maybe like you're holding up a counter spell or some sort of instant speed thing, but your board shows that you have no lands in play. They're all tapped. So your opponent tries to do their thing, and then you tap one of these guys to put a land into play, and then you cast your instant, your whatever thing that's going to save you or stop them or whatever. So it does have more opportunity to be tricky. I'm not really of that type to do that, but you do have more options, and that is a benefit. But the main thing is, if you're playing a creature heavy deck, these are bodies on the field. If you don't have a land full of hands, you can attack with them. I know that they're all weak, but when you have a Triumph of the Hordes or a Overwhelming Stampede or something, as the more bodies you have, the better. So I think that they are generally better. Next are the Cost Reducer Ramp. Now this is the category that I think I kind of dip into the least. I made a point of making one deck that prominently featured it, but otherwise it's not something that I really touch on very often. So here's some of the best ones. Emerald Medallion, Ronus' Monument, Planar Gate, Stone Calendar, and the Immortal Sun. So they all kind of have their own benefits. Emerald Medallion only costs 2 mana, and it applies to all your green spells, regardless of what it is. Instant, sorcery, creature, whatever. Ronus' Monument only benefits your creatures. So it costs the mana more, and it only will cheapen the cost of your creature spells. But it does have the ability to buff up one of your creatures by 2/2 and trample till end of turn. So that's great if you got big creatures out that don't have trample. All of a sudden, your Gigantosaurus is actually a threat because it can't be jump blocked by some stupid 1/1 token. You could, cast multiple creatures and then really pump up one thing. Maybe your commander is like a 2-power commander, but you cast like 10, 15 creatures, and all of a sudden now your commander is big enough to kill somebody with commander damage. Or maybe you got a decent, like a handful of those big creatures, like the Gigantosaurus type things, and you just buff each of them by 2/2, and more importantly, give them trample. Definitely a good card. I don't really use it, but yeah. Planar Gate, 6 mana artifact. This one makes your creatures cost 2 less to cast. So this is a perfect example of this card or this category not being great by itself. It needs to be combined with other sources of ramp. So if you've got plenty of cultivates and Kadama's reaches, and you're doing that stuff to get your mana up to 6, then you get this thing out. Then from that point on, not only do you have extra lands in play, but all your creatures cost 2 less. This one will really help you with your game plan, once you get to a certain point. But if you're staring at, just playing 1 land per turn, and then your creatures, and then on turn 6 you finally get this out as like your first thing that's going to ramp you and get you ahead, it's not very good. It looks very late game from that perspective for a ramp spell, but you do need, if you have other ways of ramping up to this point, then it's very good. Stone Calendar, this one will make all of your spells cost 1 less, so it's not just creatures. It costs 1 less to cast. So, if you're more creature heavy, Planar Gate's going to be better for the extra cost reduction. But if you're more balanced in what you're casting, Stone Calendar does have the benefit of applying to all your spells. Then Immortal Sun is a great card because it does several things. It shuts down Planeswalker decks, or even just 1 or 2, random Planeswalkers that might be in play. It allows you to draw an extra card each turn. It makes all of your spells cost 1 less, and it buffs your creatures. Great card. Should see a lot of play. Then there's Nylea Keen-Eyed and Goreclaw Terror of Kalsima. These ones are both reductions for creatures. The difference is Goreclaw specifically cares about you playing big creatures, not only for its cost reduction, but also for its buff. It will give all your big stuff 1/1 and trample. So he's definitely a little bit better. He's more synergized with big creature decks. The Nylea probably cares about smaller things. because the cost reduction of 1 is going to make a bigger difference, you know, from a 2 mana creature going down to 1 mana versus a 7 mana creature going down to 6 mana. Also, because he provides card advantage by having you pay 3, reveal top card, and if it's a creature, it goes to your hand. If you're paying 3, revealing like an 8 mana creature, which goes to your hand, and then you get to, you know, cast it for 7, not a great, you know, engine that you've got going there. But if you reveal a 2 mana creature, that goes to your hand. Now you pay 1 to cast it. That one synergizes better with smaller creatures, but it does work with all creatures. So that brings us to category 10, just the other ramp. This is the stuff that I didn't necessarily think fit the other categories, so it's just kind of a mix of different effects. The first 3, Early Harvest, Rude Awakening, and Llanowar Druid, are extremely powerful if played in the right deck and played correctly. If you've got, you know, 10 to 20 lands in play, and they all tap for 2 or 3 mana each, these cards are like Expropriate. They effectively give you an extra turn, assuming that you have cards in your hand that will draw you extra cards, and you've already got cards to cast, and you got follow-up plays. If this is the only card in your hand, it doesn't matter that you have 20 lands in play, each producing 3 mana. It won't do anything. So it does need to have other things working with it, but it's something that can take a turn that's kind of winding down and revitalize you so that you can keep casting stuff, keep digging until you get your thing that gives haste or whatever that will finish off the game. So, all extremely powerful spells. Lotus Cobra is one that I think is just generally good because it gives you a mana every time a land enters the battlefield, but it doesn't really fit in the other category, so it's just an outlier. It's by itself, and I generally don't think that that's super good because it doesn't really synergize with anything. It does synergize with, you know, having explosive vegetation and cultivates and all of those things, but it's not of the same category, so it's just in this weird position for me. As far as building a deck, it's weird to have this one thing that does go well with the other things, but is by itself as an effect. So next, Earthcraft and Cryptolithite. These are both ways to just turn your creatures into mana. As I mentioned in the video about this type of ramp, there's a key difference between the two, and that's that Cryptolithite gives the creatures the ability to tap mana of any color. So that is hindered by Summoning Sickness. If the creatures just came out, they can't tap for mana yet unless you have a way to give them haste. Earthcraft gets around that. You can tap any creature that's just come into play and generate the mana off of that. So if you have a way to create, you know, 20 tokens, all of a sudden you've just given yourself 20 mana on top of that. But then what the Earthcraft is more vulnerable to split second removal. A Crozier Grip will destroy or exile or whatever, the Earthcraft at split second speed, and you won't be able to do anything in response. With Cryptolithite, you can still tap any creatures that are able to for mana because it's a mana ability, and split second doesn't stop mana abilities. Then Sakiko, Mother of Summer, it's another card that is just kind of its own lone effect. Still very good and very applicable and would benefit most decks the same way that Lotus Cobra would, but it is a little bit more unique. It basically says that whenever your creatures deal damage, you get to have that much mana during your second main phase. So if you just, you know, you cast however many things in first main, and then you cast however many more things that you want during second main. I think that this is a very powerful effect, but it's one that I kind of shy away from at least a little bit, because if I keep casting things during second main and then I find my haste enabler and then I cast that, well, I've already gone to combat, so I can't then swing again with all the creatures that I just gave haste to. So either way, I'm like waiting another turn to do stuff. So it's kind of a feel bad for me if that happens, but it's a very good card. So now let's talk, now that we've kind of done a quick review of each of the categories and some of the best cards in it, let's talk about what philosophies you might use when putting ramp into your deck. What are some of the strategies or purposes of it? So let's start with competitive ramp. Now, I don't play CEDH, and I am by no means a source to advise you on how to do it. But it is very clear that they want to ramp as fast as possible. So what you see right now are several ways of doing that. On the very top, you got all the Mana-Dorks that cost 1 mana and produce 1 mana. To the right of them, you've got the auras that will attach to a land and it will add 1 mana. The next category will be the 2 things that allow you to play extra lands, exploration and burgeoning. They, again, if in a normal game, I would say they aren't as good as they might seem because you play out your lands really early, turn 1, turn 2, but after that you just fall off. And I don't think that's very good. But in CEDH, you need to get off to that extremely powerful start, and you just need to. Cardboard of Flowers is more likely to show up in a CEDH game than otherwise. It is a powerful effect, but I would say that it is something that it just makes more sense in a CEDH setting than in most casual pods. And then Elvish, what's her name? Elvish Pioneer and then Arboreal Grazer. Those are both things that will just let you put a land from your hand into the battlefield tapped. They are things that I really like in an ETB deck. They're things that I like in a creature-based deck. But as far as CEDH goes, their purpose, if they show up at all, is just going to be the fact that they are a 1 mana thing that will ramp you. It's just turn 1 ramp. So that's why they might be included in a more competitive deck. And then we get to all the 2 mana spells that get you a land out of your library. Rampant Growth, Rampant Growth, Nature's Lore, Secure Tribe Elder, Farseek, 3 Visits into the North. These are all things that just get you a land out of your library onto the battlefield tapped. Again, long term, their value is much worse than some of the things like Cultivate and everything, but they don't have time to waste for that stuff. In a normal game, you could wait till turn 4 and the first spell of your game is Explosive Vegetation, and it's not really going to hurt you. In a CEDH game, you can't do that. You have to get that early ramp. And then you get the 2 mana Mana-Dorks. Utopia Tree, Humble Naturalist, Sylvan Caryatid, Paradise Druid, they all tap for mana of any color, so they're obviously going to provide a lot of value in multicolored decks. The Humble Naturalist says that you can only use that mana to cast a creature spell. Depending on what the person's doing, that could be an important restriction, or it might not. Then you got the 2 that will say they'll tap for any color of mana that one of your lands will produce. That's the Harvester Druid and Naga Vitalist. So if you happen to have like a dual land, say Island Swamp or something, then you could tap that land for the blue and then use this Mana-Dork to produce the black, or you could tap it for blue and use the Mana-Dork for another blue for double that. So if you don't have your colors set up, these guys are going to not quite be as good. But if you do, then they'll help you get what you need and not really much downside. And of course, in that scenario that I just gave, you have one dual land that could provide one of 2 colors. With one of these Mana-Dorks, you can get both of those colors, or 2 of the one. And then Sylvok Explorer just lets you tap for any color that an opponent will do. So in most cases, that'll get you at least 2-3 colors minimum. It could get you all 5. Bloom Tender is one that is great for the more colors your deck has, because it will tap for a mana for each color that you have a permanent on board for. So if your devotion is at least 1 of a color, it'll give you 1 of that color. Devoted Druid is something that will tap for just only 1 mana, and it costs 2 to cast, but by putting on -1/-1 counter on it, you can at least untap it and do it a second time once without killing it. If you have ways to remove the -1 counters, or if you have ways to put 1/1 counters on it, or any other way to abuse that, then it can be better than even its face value, which is the ability to tap for minimum 1, but once it'll tap for 2. And then we go into the things that Earthcraft and Cryptothrite, again, as I mentioned, they have their own unique effects. Earthcraft could not only be used for ramp, but also used to combo. If you have there's a known combo that's more seen in Legacy, I believe. Squirrelcraft, Squirrel Nest, aura attached to a land. When you tap the land, you produce a 1/1 Squirrel token. You use that Squirrel token you tap the Squirrel token to untap the land, tap the land, make another Squirrel, tap that Squirrel, and then you just go infinite on creatures. I don't know that you're going to see that too much in Commander, but it can be done. Cryptothrite, again, if you just have a way to produce a bunch of creatures, token or otherwise, then it turns them into Mana-Dorks. Lotus Cobra, just get an extra land for playing land, or get an extra mana for playing lands, and then Emerald Medallion to make your stuff cheaper. Overall, I'm not a big fan of making this your ramp package. Again, if you're on CDH, it makes sense that you need stuff that is very cheap, very low on the mana curve, that will ramp you very, very early in the game. But if you're just playing a casual game and you're looking at these cards to be your ramp, I think that's very ill-advised, because whatever ramp benefit they give you is going to quickly become insignificant. Even as early as turn 5 or 6, whatever ramp these things give you is just not going to matter at that point, and they're just not usually going to be super effective in most casual games. So that's, I guess, kind of my stance on it. Great and competitive, but if you're going kind of later or more casual, then this is not the role model. This is not the example. So next, I want to talk about the generically good ramp. Now, this is a ramp package that I think could make any deck very good, and the rest of your deck kind of doesn't matter. It's just always going to be effective. So I took 10 of those cards that I said that are land ramp. You could choose other ones. I didn't pick these ones out for any particular reason, aside from the 3 that are 3 mana: Colony, Hard Expedition, Skyshroud Claim. Colony because it comes out on turn 2, Skyshroud Claim because it gets the lands into play untapped, and then Traverse and Boundless can get you a lot of lands. But if you play any of the other ones that you saw earlier, then it's always just going to be a good package. And then also 5 mana doublers. Now, these 5 are the ones that I think are the best because they are cheaper in mana, and they don't have as many downsides as some of the other ones. They're not creatures, so they're not as vulnerable to board wipes. And in the case of Zendikar Resurgent, even though it's 7 mana, it's high on the mana curve, it will draw you cards. It's card draw as well. So I think that almost any deck could be made pretty strong and powerful just with this mana ramp. Of course, you would need a good card draw package as well, but even a relatively crappy deck with just weak creatures and not a whole lot else to speak of will be strong with this ramp package. And then what you could do is add a few more cards. Here you see Stonecedar Hierophant, Patron of the Orochi, Early Harvest, Rude Awakening, Lantern War Druid. In most cases, I would say it's unnecessary to add these to the deck, but as I mentioned earlier, with like Early Harvest and Rude Awakening and Lantern War Druid, they're almost like an extra turn spell. So if you've got 10, 12 lands in play, and maybe you just cast your mana doublers this turn, and that's where most of your lands are tapped. So you have like 3 of them in play, so your 10 lands produce 30 mana. You're down to like 4 or 5. You cast the Early Harvest, you untap everything. Now you got access to 30 mana again. You can start casting either your big card draw spell, or if you've got a bunch of effects that'll draw you cards every time you play a creature, like Guardian Project, Zendikar Resurgent, stuff like that. You can just start casting your creatures and drawing 3 cards every time you do, or whatever it is, and eventually hit what you need to win. They are extremely powerful in the right circumstance, and this is the right circumstance. It is kind of overkill at this point, which is why I don't really do a whole lot of that, but it is a way to up your win percentage and do kind of big, powerful things, to include these things. Patron of the Orochi, aside from, kind of having the same recurable effect as the other things, is that if you have anything that is a mana sink, suppose you have a enchantment or creature that says pay 4 mana, make a token, then you can tap Patron of the Orochi to untap all forest and all green creatures. Patron of the Orochi is a green creature each turn, so you can do it on your turn, your opponent's turn, your second opponent's turn, your third opponent's turn, and then each time you do, you're tapping all of those forests for however much mana that they're able to generate, and then sinking it into whatever thing is making you tokens or is a mana sink for whatever other reasons. So that one can be extra good with that synergy. All of these would be able to basically keep your turn going and give you the power and ability to close out the game all in one turn, a turn that you may have started with like 6 lands and 1 mana doubler, and then next thing you know, you got 2 more mana doublers and 4 more lands, and then you untap all of them, and then you have 30 mana available to you. These are the things that will make for a very explosive turn where you can just do all the spells in your deck. So next, I want to talk about creature-heavy decks. So the creature-heavy deck ramp is basically intended for decks that have at least 50 creatures in them. So in a deck like that, you're probably going to have cards like the Great Henge, Guardian Project, Zendikar Resurgent, Beast Whisperer. Those are all things that will draw you cards every time you play a spell. And Lurking Predators is especially good because every time one of your opponents casts a spell, you reveal the top card of your library, which is probably going to be a creature, then you put it into play. So if your deck is chock full of creatures, you're probably not going to want the land-based ramped, the Cultivates, Kodama's Reach, all those, because every time you cast one of those, you're not drawing off of Guardian Project, Zendikar Resurgent, everything else. You want creatures that will ramp you. Now, some Mana-Dorks will be okay, but you don't want that to be kind of the strength of your deck, because really it'll be the weakness of your deck. Because not only do the Mana-Dorks come, they need to get over their summoning sickness, but one board wipe and you're screwed. You'd probably run into, if you played that way many times, you'd probably run into a lot of situations where you've only got 3 or 4 lands in play, like you're missing land drops and you're kind of mana screwed in that sense. But because you have a bunch of creatures that tap for mana, maybe you're able to produce 9, 10, 12 mana per turn. Then a board wipe happens. Now you're actually mana screwed. So part of the advantage to playing green and Mana-Dorks and other accelerants, any kind of mana ramp, is to not be in the situation where you're mana screwed nearly as often as other players might be. Mana-Dorks will potentially get you ahead for a while, and then if they die, you're right back to square one. At least with things like Wood Elves, Avatar of Growth, Farhaven Elf, Yavimaya Dryad, and Wild Wander, if you're playing a creature-heavy deck, you draw a card from casting them off of, Great Henge, Zendikar Resurgent, etc. Then they enter, then they get you a land out of your library, which not only ramps you, it thins your deck so that you're more likely to draw creatures whenever you're drawing off of these cast triggers, and it means that you are a lot safer as far as your ramp goes for future turns when a board wipe does happen, or if a board wipe happens. Also, Mana-Dorks have to tap to produce mana. These don't. So while it might feel bad to block with the Llanowar Elves because it's not just costing you a creature, it's costing you mana, blocking with one of these creatures not as much of a big deal. It's not really a problem to lose one of these. Or if at some point later in the game you got like 6 Mana-Dorks in play, but you have to tap them to produce the mana to cast Overwhelming Stampede, that's, 6 less creatures that you're going to have to actually attack with the giant combat buff that you just gave them. On the other hand, with things like these, they're not tapping for mana. You got your mana from lands. So you're going to tap those lands to cast the Overwhelming Stampede and have those many extra bodies to really swing out with and do big damage. So in a creature-heavy deck, I do think the things that when they enter the battlefield, they get you lands into play, very good. The other category that I think really combos well with it is the things that have to put lands into play. And this is one that I've really warmed up to more lately because, one, they're very cheap to cast. So if you get it on turn 1 or 2, that's great. If you get it down on turn 6 or 7 or 8, after you have your card draw things like Beast Whisperer and Guardian Project out, you're paying 1 to get a creature into play and draw a card. If, once they don't have Summoning Sickness, you've got your engine going where you're casting a creature, draw 3 cards, cast a creature, draw 3 cards, cast a creature, draw 3 cards. Now you've got like 4 or 5 lands in hand. Normally, you would either have to throw them away when you discard, or if you keep them, good for you, you've got your next 4 land drops in hand for whatever good that'll do you. But with these guys, you can, tap them to put them into play and keep your engine going, and to also not have to discard as much. So they actually do provide a lot more value than what they seem that they would. They're definitely overperformers in a heavy creature deck. So both of these, while I would say that Mana-Dorks are a good thing to include a little bit of in a massive creature heavy deck, they're more for getting you like off the ground and running, like turn 1, turn 2, and these are the things that are actually going to really be effective in winning you the game. Now, Mana-Dorks that produce a ton of mana, a single Priest of Titania, a single Karametra's Acolyte, Marwyn, anything that's going to tap for 10, 15, 20 mana, yeah, those Mana-Dorks are going to be huge performers. But the Mana-Dorks that only tap for like 1 or 2, good very early, but they get worse as the game goes on, whereas each of these things start out good and just get better. So next, I want to talk about Tap Matters deck ramp. So, like I kind of mentioned earlier, if you want to play the kind of deck where you just want to touch your cards as much as possible and just keep going in circles, maybe you have combos, maybe you are doing pinger stuff, whatever the case may be, if your deck is full of things that say like untap target creature, untap target land, untap target artifact, you have an artifact that says untap a creature, then you're going to want your ramp to follow that same pattern because it'll synergize very well with everything else that your deck is trying to do. So for that, I think the auras are a good combo. Wild Growth, Utopia Sprawl, Overgrowth, Market Festival, Dawn's Reflection, because if you have all those 10 creatures that you see in front of you that will untap your lands, that's a good combo. And then you have the other things that say untap target creature, which will untap your one of these guys, who then untap the land that produces 3 or 4 mana. You really get that combo going in a good engine. And I'll just give you a very basic example of how you can get off to a very good fast start. Turn 1, you play a forest, you play an Arbor Elf. Turn 2, you play a second forest, you tap 1 forest, play Wild Growth on the other one, tap that other one for 2, tap Arbor Elf to untap that second one, tap it for 2 more. You have 4 mana in your mana pool, and you've already spent a mana on turn 2. So going into turn 3, you'll have at least 5 mana available to you, 6 or more if you've done other ramp, 6 if you just play one other land, more if you have some other ramp that you did on turn 2. So yeah, these are actually pretty good and effective, and especially again if you got things that say some of these will just say tap it to untap a land. If you got another creature that says tap it to untap a creature, if you got the artifact that says tap it to untap a creature, then these things will all work together very well to either untap your land to produce tons of mana if that's what you need, or if your untap creature effects need to be used to untap your creatures that do other things, ping or buff or draw cards or whatever the other effects are. You get the options and the synergy, and everything goes really well there. And then the other things that follow the same pattern are the things that tap to put extra lands into play. So again, if you got something that will tap to draw you a card, then you got something that will untap that, then tap it again to draw another card. If that's how your draw engine's going, well, you're probably going to draw a decent amount of lands. These guys will tap to put those lands into play. If you got some, loop that you can go through, then you can put a bunch of extra lands into play and do whatever combo it is that you're going for. So next will be the Spell Slinger deck ramp. So this is it's not just a deck where you want to cast a bunch of things, because like the creature-based decks, that's something where you want to cast 20, 30 creatures all in one turn and just overrun your opponents. These ones specifically are more geared towards instants and sorceries. So I kind of chose 4 commanders that might reflect that. Wart the Raid Mother, Kalamax the Stormsire, and Riku of 2 Reflections all will have ways to copy instants or sorceries right on the commander. Ydra's Maelstrom Wielder will cascade. So every time you cast something, it cascades on something else. So ideally, you want to cast as many things per turn to cascade into many other things. You could take that in a creature route, but I would assume more often than not, you're probably going to be more inclined to lean into instants and sorceries. So, also going in the same pattern, whether it's in one of these 4 commanders or not, if your deck is likely to include things like Bosium Strip, which allows you to basically play instants and sorceries out of your graveyard, Primal Amulet, which on the front side discounts instants and sorceries, on the back side it's a land that will tap for a mana when used for an instant or sorcery copies it. Twinning Staff, which gives you an additional copy to a spell if you've already copied it, and you can pay 7 and tap it to make a copy. Mirari, pay 3 to copy instant or sorcery. Sphinx Bone Wand, and Sentinel Tower deal damage to your opponents every time you play an instant or sorcery. So those are all... They reward you for playing instants and sorceries. If those are the kind of effects that you like, if that's the kind of deck that you're building, then you're going to want all of the land ramp spells, because they are instants and sorceries. So in this case, while I would normally say 10 of them is good and then like 5 mana doublers, I would say if you are going for this style of deck, you'd probably want 15, maybe 20, but probably 15 will suffice. Not only does it thin your deck of all the lands so that you are more likely to draw instants and sorceries, but also because it will ramp you, and without the mana doublers, you're going to need as many lands as possible to give you all the mana that you're not getting from those doublers. So in this case, I am much more accepting of those 2 mana ones that only get you 1 land, because you're not nearly as reliant on them. When you got 15 or 20 things that will get you lands out of your library, it doesn't matter if some of them only get 1, because you're gonna have plenty of others that will get you 2 or 3, and you really need to get the things that are lower on the curve and come out earlier to really get started. If you had 20 things that ramp you, but they all cost 4 or 5 mana, then it's not going to be very effective. So in this case, the earlier mana curve is much more valuable, to the point where I'd even include Nissa's Triumph and Gaia's Bounty, which don't ramp you. They just get you the lands to your hand. So it's card advantage, and it prevents you from missing land drops, but it's not ramp. And then for the instances where you've drawn a bunch of cards and you've got just too many lands in hand, Summer Bloom, Explore, and depending on which mode you choose on Journey of Discovery, there are just ways to allow you to put extra lands into play from your hand. Explorer also does have the benefit of drawing you a card. And then, again, Early Harvest and Rooted Awakening, these are already spells that can basically be like Expropriate, like extra turn type spells, with the way that they keep you going within a same turn. Normally, I think they combo very well with those mana doublers if your land's already tapped for 2 or 3, but in this case, they also work extremely well because you'll get extra copies of the spell. So even if your land's tapped for 1 mana apiece, when you untap them 3 times, it works out kind of the same way. So this is kind of a good example of what would go in a Spell Slinger deck. And I think that if that's what you're going for, a Spell Slinger deck, then having a lot of these, again, 15 or 20 of them, is going to do you more good than you might initially think, than what you might instinctively assume. So that brings us to what I think is the single best ramp card. The one card that stands above them all, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier. I said it was on this page. Can you guess which one it is? Here it is. I imagine none of you were thinking this. It's not by any measurement a staple of Commander. It's not heavily played, but it should be. So, Stone Cedar Hierophant, 4 mana, 1/1, human druid. Whenever a land comes into play under your control, untap it. Tap, untap target land. So let's just take this at face value. Let's say you have your lands in play and they're all just basic lands. You tap your forest for a mana. You tap this to untap it. You tap your forest for a second mana. You play your land for turn. This untaps, then you tap it to untap that forest. You tap the forest for a third mana. Right there, it's better than the other things that untap. That's just at its base minimum value. There are ways that this thing will overperform that. Let's start with the things on the left side, because the way I look at it is that those things will make Stone Cedar Hierophant better. A Wild Growth, Dawn's Reflection, Overgrowth, Vernal Bloom, Mana Reflection, Gauntlet of Power, anything that makes your lands tap for more than 1 mana. Because, let's just assume one of those is in play, like a Wild Growth. You tap your forest for 2 mana. You tap Stone Cedar Hierophant to untap it. You tap the forest again for 2 more mana. You have 4. You play your land for turn. Stone Cedar Hierophant untaps. You tap her, untap that forest, tap it again. You now have 6 mana off of that 1 land. Stone Cedar Hierophant is so powerful, it makes cards like Mana Reflection and Vernal Bloom and all those other things better. The best cards in the color are made better by this one. That's insanely good. Now let's look at some of the other cards that are extremely good sources of ramp. Ranger's Path, Skyshroud Claim, Boundless Realms. Now again, let's just assume you're just using basics, nothing special. Ranger's Path, you get 2 forests into play, tapped. Stone Cedar Hierophant will have 2 untapped triggers. Now, you could just tap her twice to untap those 2 forests that came into play. You just turned Ranger's Path into Skyshroud Claim, because you just got 2 forests out of your library into play, and you untap them. Stone Cedar Hierophant makes those cards better. So, again, this is a card that's so great that I think I said it backwards before. Wild Growth, Dawn's Reflection, Overgrowth, Vernal Bloom, Mana Reflection, Gauntlet of Power, those things make Stone Cedar Hierophant better. Stone Cedar Hierophant makes cards like Ranger's Path, Skyshroud Claim, and Boundless Realms better. So she's on both ends of improving your ramp. So she will make Ranger's Path better by making it into a Skyshroud Claim effectively. Well, Skyshroud Claim will cost 4, it'll put 2 forests into play, untapped, so she'll have 2 untapped triggers. You tap her twice to untap 2 of the forests that you used to pay for Skyshroud Claim. So now you've still got, after having cast Skyshroud Claim for 4, you still have 4 lands that are untapped in addition to whatever else. And you've thinned your deck by 2, and you're going to be ahead by 2 lands on the following turn. But she just made Skyshroud Claim pay for itself. She made Skyshroud Claim better. What about a Boundless Realms? What if you have 10 lands in play? You tap 7 of them for Boundless Realms. You get 10 lands in play. You have 10 untap triggers with Stonecedar Hierophant. You untap those 10 lands. Now you took a spell like Boundless Realms, which ramps you hard by getting so many lands into play, and by making them untap, you actually gained mana off of Boundless Realms. She's so good, she made Boundless Realms into a spell that nets you mana. That's crazy awesome. Now let's look at some other things that by themselves are going to be very good. We'll start easy with the Lotus Field. Taps for 3 mana. Say it's already in play, you have Stonecedar Hierophant. You tap the Lotus Field for 3. You untap it with Stonecedar, tap it again for another 3. You play your land for turn, you untap her, you tap her, you untap Lotus Field, you tap it. You'll generate 9 mana off of it instead of the normal 3. Very good. If you happen to, say, have Lotus Field out, and then you cast the Boundless Realms for 10, getting 10 lands in play, you're going to be able to untap that Lotus Field 10 times. So, net 30 mana? Well, you would get 30 mana. So, net 23 mana? Yeah, pretty awesome. Then you look at things like Nykthos, Gaia's Cradle, Cabal Coffers. If you happen to have an elf-based deck or something where an elf will produce a ton of mana, Wirewood Lodge would also fit in that same basic category. You can net a ton of mana. We'll just use Gaia's Cradle as the example here. Let's say it taps for 7. Tap it for 7, untap it, tap it for 7 more, play your land for turn, untap it again, tap it for another 7. That's 21. You play the Boundless Realms, you get 10 lands into play. You untap the Gaia's Cradle 10 more times, produce 70 more mana. So that's 81 you've produced, 7 of which you've spent. You're up 74 mana left for the remainder of the turn. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good combo right there. You took Gaia's Cradle and made it a dozen times better. That's a powerful card. And that's what really makes this card so awesome. You don't have to do anything else to build around it. Even if you had no other ramp, but you had enough lands so that you hit your land drop every single turn, which is kind of what the first example I led with. Tap your forest for 1, untap it, tap it for another one, play your land for turn, untap that first forest again, tap it, that first forest will produce 3. Just off of the worst case scenario with no other ramp in the deck. Not that you haven't drawn it or anything like that. No other ramp in the deck. And she's very good. If you have built your deck with any other ramp, you built it properly, she just makes everything better. Or things make her better. This is, without a doubt, the best ramp card in green. And more likely than not, the best card in green. Because as much as I don't want to really make a top 5 list or a top 10 list, which I know I already said, Vernal Bloom, Mana Reflection, and Zendikar Resurgent are all on the top 5 or top 10, it's really hard to say what is like the best cards of the color, because something that's extremely good sometimes, like Doubling Season, if your deck doesn't have 1/1 counters, it doesn't have tokens, Doubling Season doesn't do anything. Very powerful card, but you do have to have a reason, a justification for even including it in the deck. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's medium, sometimes it's the best thing in the deck that just makes the deck so much more powerful. Sometimes it could be useless if you put it in a deck where it's not going to do anything. This card, always, without exception, will do amazing things for the deck. So, on that note, I think it's time to end this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And I will be back soon with whatever the next series is. Thank you for joining me.